that's a lovely introduction, and you're right. I do love teaching people about this. I could, as Beck probably knows, I could talk about it all day. So I will try not to this time. We've got a time limit. So I'll be covering a whole bunch of things about Windows, which is one of my favorite topics because there are so many things you can do to make your Windows better for all budgets. You'll also be able to get a copy of these slides afterwards, and it's being recorded as well. So, and I might, go through things a little bit fast at times, especially when there's quite technical things, but don't worry because you can look back and feel free to also ask me questions. You can send Beck questions and she'll send them on to me and I can answer them. So it's really nice to be here. I've pretty much just introduced myself and Beck has too. So I might just get started actually. Today we're going to talk, first of all, I'll just quickly talk about how heat moves in and out of windows. There's a whole bunch of ways that it does that. And when we talk about window improvements, we're just talking about ways to manage that in one direction or the other. We'll talk through window treatments, which is another word for window coverings, or that's curtains and blinds. Window glazing upgrades, window shading, how you can use your windows to best effect, even if you don't do anything to change them, and also some tips on where to go from here, how to start planning for what you might do in your home. So how heat moves through windows, it's the same way that heat moves into and out of a home, which is by radiation. And that's when, for example, the sun is shining on a window and it comes straight through, hits the ground of your inside building and warms that up, and then that heat goes through your room. Also by conduction, which is where, say, the sun shines on a window frame that is metal or on window glass, and it just travels through that to the other side, and then it gets picked up by a convection current of air. So don't worry too much about these terms if they're confusing, but for some of you that might be interesting to know that's what's going on. So let's get started with window treatments. We often talk about this as being the first place to start, mainly because it's often easier. It can be quite cheap depending on what you end up doing. So with window treatments, I would just like to mention that it doesn't matter if you're in a rental or, a purpose-built passive home, whether you've got no budget or a huge budget, there are things that you can do in all aspects of your windows to make them better. Often with window treatments, it's one of the simpler ones. And what we want to do with a window treatment is reduce the air flow across the window. The reason we want to do that is because when air passes across a window, that's how heat gets either picked up in summer and brought into the room or dropped off in winter and leaves through the window. So a window treatment, the job of it is just to create a bit of a pocket around the window. And there are many ways you can do that. And really, I think rather than saying this is a good treatment or covering and this is a bad one, it's more about how each of them is installed. So as an example, a curtain like this, a heavy lined curtain, generally that's a really good treatment because it naturally covers the window and goes around the sides down to the ground. On the other hand, you could have installed it so that it's not quite covering the window and doesn't go down to the ground. It's not going to be as good. In the same way, you could have a Holland blind, which is the really common roller blinds, that you've installed really close to the window frame so it does prevent that heat, the air moving, or you could install it right away so there's this big gap and lots of air. So always think back to how well whatever you're doing is trapping air across the window. This is another example of a good option if you prefer blinds, which is a honeycomb blind that's installed inside a deep window rebate. That gives a really good effect too because it's trapping a layer of air and almost no air trapping the air inside the honeycomb, but also preventing air crossing the window. When you have any sort of curtain or drape, it's really worth putting this thing on top. It's called an invisible pelmet. It has a similar effect to a box pelmet, but many people prefer it because it's literally invisible. So you get it stops the heat moving up and down across the window, but you can't see it. There are some other things you can do. Roman blinds are quite good because they incorporate a pelmet here at the top. And in this instance, the curtain is using the ceiling as a pelmet. It's been hung from the ceiling. So that really works well as well. Just to give a bit of an overview, this is a comparison of the impact of different window treatments or coverings on the movement of heat through the window. And you can see here, if we start at the top, we've got the least efficient option, which is a bare single glazed window. So a single glazed window with no covering at all. Then if you look at the stars, this is, for example, just a thin curtain or a Holland blind with no pelmet. That's that one. And then if you add a pelmet to that, it goes to the blue star, which, as you can see, is probably double the thermal protection that you're getting, double the reduction in heat transfer. And the other thing I want to point out is that this is a standard double glazed window with no covering whatsoever. And this is a single glazed window with a nice heavy drape and a pelmet. So a lot of people are surprised that they could actually get a similar effect to double glazing by putting a really good covering on their existing single glazed window. And that can be a bit of a relief sometimes because glazing upgrades can potentially be expensive, but I've got some lower cost ideas too. So glazing, I'll just skip back one sec. So I've got a little bit here of technical info, and this is mainly about if you're buying new windows or replacing any windows or doing any bigger picture things. So if that's not what you're interested in, feel free to zone out for about 4 or 5 slides. It is more complex. Like I said, you can read back on it if it's of use. When we talk about how well windows protect us from the movement of heat through them, we talk about it in terms of U value. Now, if you've attended the session that was run on insulation, you'll know that when we talk about insulation in ceilings or walls, we talk about R value. U value is the same, except it's expressed in the opposite direction. So with R value, the higher the R value, the better. With U value, the lower the U value, the better. And really what it's reflecting is how well a window, a whole window, which includes frames, glazing, all of the bits and pieces, how well that reduces the ability of heat to move through. If you want to learn more about this, there's a really great video on YouTube by Efficiency Matrix that just goes through this in a lot of detail. But as an example, this shows the comparative U value of different kinds of windows. And this first one here, that's pretty much the worst thermal protection you could have in a window. So it's single glazed, aluminium framed, and aluminium frames transfer a lot of heat. The U value is 6.7, which is quite high. If you compare that to the best kind of or most protective window, that would be double glazed with some argon fill, low E coating, and a timber frame. That's 2. That's a big difference. And what it means is that this window allows more than 3 times the amount of heat to pass through it than this one. So that's what people are talking about when they talk about U value. Another thing you might hear, especially if you're buying new windows, is about the solar heat gain coefficient. And this is a measure between 0 and 1 of how easily solar heat from the sun can get through the window. And the lower the SHGC, solar heat gain coefficient, the less heat passes through. But that brings us to the question of whether we always want the low solar heat gain coefficient. And as with quite a few things with windows, it's not as simple as insulation R value, where basically more is better. With windows, there are certain things that will depend on where they are in your house, what orientation, and what climate you live in. So, for example, you might decide that you want a window with a low solar heat gain coefficient that's on the west facing windows of your house, but you might want one with a high solar heat gain coefficient on the north, because you actually want as much winter sun to come through as possible. Don't worry about any of this if you're just upgrading existing windows, but at least you now know what that's referring to, and you'll be able to look up more information on that if you want to. Low E coatings is another one that you'll hear about, and this is getting spoken of more and more frequently. It's another one that's a little complex because it depends on what your goal is. This is a lot of text, I know, on this slide. Really, what I want to say is that the main things are there's two types. There's hard coat, which is what you would add if you've already got glass and you need to add it on after the fact. Then there's soft coat, which is in the middle of double or triple glazing, and that's put in during the manufacture process of that. Then there's high transmission and low transmission. And the easiest way to think about that is that, say this is your window, this is inside, you can see that there. If your window is in a place where you need it to reject heat from coming in, you put it at 2, which faces out, so that when sunshine is coming towards your window, it gets bounced back. But if you're in a cold climate, or if it's windows where you don't want to lose heat out of them, you put it on this inside facing panel, which means if you've got warm heat here from a heater, it bounces on there and goes back into the house, so you're not losing heat. I would say for most of us in cold climates, we'd be going for the Surface 3. Anyway, I'm not going to talk about that too much, just that you know what it is and that you don't want to necessarily get it at the same place on every window. It depends what your goal is. The final thing is tinting, because a lot of people, when I'm doing assessments for people, they hear a lot about tinting and coatings that go directly onto the glass. And my response is always that they can be good, but there's such a huge range of coatings and they do all sorts of different things. So you really need to know what it is that it's being sold for. A lot of the time it's tinting, which is sold because it's really good at reflecting heat away in summer and keeping your house cooler. And it's true, it does that really well. But the thing is that it also does it in winter when we want sun coming in. And a lot of people don't realise that. I've actually been in houses where they've had tinting applied to every window in the whole house for summer benefit. And it makes it cold and a bit darker as well. So don't just lightly, if they say it's brilliant for reducing heat, just make sure you ask about the other aspect as well. Generally, I wouldn't do it at all for our climate. All right, now we're going on to the fun stuff, which is the actual things you can do. When we talk about glazing upgrades, for many people that just automatically means double glazing. But in fact, what every glazing upgrade is doing is adding a gap between a window pane and some other material. And because that is actually what you're doing, you can do it in many, many ways. And some of them are really cheap. Then there's sort of mid-cost, and then there's the really expensive ones. Couple of notes to make. One is that a third of heat transfer through windows is actually through the frames if they're any kind of metal. So if you have a steel or an aluminium frame, it's a little bit different than if you have a timber or a UPVC frame. UPVC is plastic. The other thing is that if you're having trouble with excess heat gain in summer and you've got direct sun shining on your window and coming through the window, the any sort of glazing upgrade, double glazing or secondary glazing, isn't going to prevent that. What you really need is external shading. So keep these things in mind when you're working out what to do. There's a whole stack of things that you can do that are low cost, pretty easy to do. They're not necessarily going to be the most beautiful things, but if you're in a rental or if you're low income or if you just need a really quick fix, before as you budget for other things, these are all really effective ideas. And the simplest one that you may have heard of is bubble wrap on the window. The reason it works is because by sticking that on the window, you've actually stuck a whole lot of air gaps on the window, and that's what we want. I ran a workshop just last weekend showing people how to do various forms of these low-cost upgrades, and one of the people said, yeah, I did bubble wrap, and it worked. In fact, she said she'd done it for 4 years in a row, and it works so well. So there you go. Might not be the most beautiful thing, but can serve its purpose. Another option is something like this. This particular one is rigid foam board that someone has cut to size and put in the window to reduce the amount of window that's transferring heat. You could also put corflute cut to size, which could be either from old election signs, or you can actually buy sheets of corflute from the hardware store at not much cost. This one is foam board, and these pictures, you'll see they're not professional pictures because people don't do this as a professional job. These are just snaps that people have taken of things they've used that have worked for them. So this one is foam board with a foil lining, and they've completely blocked that window. So I don't think they'd be getting significant heat loss or gain through that window. This is another option, which is cellular clear acrylic. What I mean by that is it's got little cells in it, a bit like honeycomb, and you can buy it in a sheet and cut it to size, and they've just attached it on there. It's not only creating a gap between that cellular acrylic and the glass, but the cellular acrylic also has gaps in it. So in effect, it's sort of like triple glazing and would really reduce heat coming through. And then this is the final option just on this page, which is a product called Clear Comfort. And it's a thin membrane. It's mainly for if you have timber framed windows. You put double-sided tape around the window frame, so not on the window but on the frame. You stick this membrane on, use a hairdryer like you can see he's doing, and you hairdry and it shrinks, and it's really amazing. It's almost invisible and it's very low cost, about $200 for enough for 10 windows. Removable panels. This is another low cost one. It's suitable especially if you have, well, first of all, if you're in a rental and you're not allowed to attach anything, but also if you had aluminium frames and you want to bypass any heat transfer through those frames. There's the link there for an article where they describe how to do this. You might want to look it up. But what you do is create a removable frame using fly screen frames, just as if you were making a fly screen, and you stick what they call tablecloth plastic in it. It's just it's a sort of soft, clear plastic. And then this shows them put into the windows. This was on a rental, and they've done that, and they've included a honeycomb blind there. So they've gone from what would have been a really poor window, allowing lots of heat transfer, and now they've made it much, much better. Stepping up, we've got solid secondary glazing. Secondary glazing is, when I say that, all it means is that your existing original window and glass and frame is all left where it is, and we put another panel over the top. So anything that is called secondary glazing. Double glazing actually only refers to when you have a purpose-made panel of double glass that's sealed around the edges. So it's for it's for new windows, but you can have double glazed panels that you insert into existing timber frames, but it's quite different because it's 2 panels of glass. With this one, there's the DIY version. Renew have an article on that as well. And the reason this looks all papery is because it comes with paper on it, and when you've affixed it, you take that off, but that's just to stop it getting scratched. This is a professional version of this. So this is called Eco Glaze, and there's another company called Magnetite who do this. They put magnetic tape on the window frames and then cut clear acrylic to size and stick it onto that first layer of magnetic tape with another layer. And it looks very neat. It's much lower cost. Eco Glaze actually have a DIY version of it, which ends up about $300 per square metre, which is great. I mean, it's still an investment, but it's a lot less than replacing windows. And they also have professional installers as well. This is some examples of more professional secondary glazing. So I mentioned Magnetite, that's an example from their website, and Stop Noise, that's an example from their website. They all do that same thing where they put a second panel over the existing panel. Now, this option won't suit everybody, but it might suit some. And it's where you basically take out your existing window and buy a second-hand one from an online marketplace. Often they're not actually used windows, but they've been ordered for a build and then the design has changed or whatever, and builders end up with these windows that they want to get rid of. So they'll advertise them cheap to move them on quickly. And this might suit you if you don't mind if the windows in your home aren't matching, or if you're like we did it, we knocked out a wall and put in a French door, and so there was, it wasn't going to match anyway, but it's it's a fantastic French door, double glazed UPVC framed for a fraction of what it would have cost to get it new. So this is an option in some cases, but you have to have a handy person or a builder who's willing to put it in, and you've got to make sure it's the right size, so it can be a bit more fiddly. Next, so this is all from lowest cost to highest cost. The next one up, and the second highest cost, is retrofitting new double glazed panels into existing timber frames. This is a really good one for if you have a heritage overlay, or if you have heritage windows like sash windows that you really want to keep that look, because what they do is they pretty much deconstruct the window, order double glazed panels that fit into it, and then they reconstruct the window using carpentry. They fix any latches and weights and pulleys. They draft seal the window at the same time. So it's quite labour intensive, and therefore it's fairly expensive. But what you end up with is the equivalent of what, a brand new window, but it's in the existing frame. So it retains all of its heritage look. Because it's a created double glazed panel, you can have argon fill, you can have low E coating. And if you have stained glass and you don't want to get rid of it, they can actually take that away and enclose it within double glazing and put it back. So it's a fantastic option in some situations. And then the highest cost, of course, is the one that is the only one most people have heard of, which is completely pulling out your windows and frames and putting in new ones. If you do this one, just keep in mind that because of the importance of the frames being responsible for 1/3 of the heat, this is a single glazed timber framed window, and if you change that to double glazed aluminium framed, you're actually only creating a very small improvement because you've improved the glass, but you've made the frames worse. So if you are going to change single glazed timber framed, try and get the double glazed timber or UPVC framed for a better effect. But this is also interesting because it shows that you do reduce the heat loss, but it's not dramatic. Like, it's not as dramatic as sometimes people might think. It's not that you go to zero heat transfer. You're still getting significant heat transfer. All right. Just one quick one on skylights, because they're often quite a big issue in terms of heat transfer. Um, if you don't have any, try and avoid putting them in is the basic idea, and put in just regular lighting, or you can put in what's called an LED skylight alternative. They're really good as well. So they look like a skylight, but there's no hole in the ceiling. And if you do have skylights already, then you can make sure you insulate the skylight shafts. You can try and put a ceiling level panel here, so that instead of this shaft being open and just this piece of glass between you and outside, you put a ceiling panel here of that cellular clear acrylic, and that contains the heat. This is one of those skylight alternatives, the LED ones. All right, I'll keep going. Window shading. This one is important because we need to use it for our benefit, but also be able to take it away for our winter benefit. Whenever we're talking about window shading, it's important to know what orientation your home is at. And if it's, we're living in existing houses, most of us, so we can't actually change it, but it's useful to know what orientation all your windows are, so that you can make the best use of the winter sun and work out ways to, just to help your home perform as well as it can. In this example, it's really well set up to block summer sun from coming in, but to allow winter sun to come in. And this particular one has thermal mass here, it must be on a slab. And so the winter sun's coming in here, heating up the thermal mass and warming up the room. It's perfect. But just say you have a tree out the front and it grows up and it's now blocking that winter sun, which means this thermal mass is not able to warm up, and instead it's relying on your heater being on, which it is then getting sucked into that colder thermal mass and using up energy. So in that case, could you trim the tree? I've seen houses before that have beautiful north-facing aspects, but they have hedges that have just grown up so high that the sun isn't coming in, and it's just a simple matter of trimming the hedges, or maybe replacing them with something deciduous that drops its leaves. It's especially important if you have thermal mass in the home, as in concrete floor or tiles, things like that, because they're always going to be at about 15 degrees, which is the ambient ground temperature. And the only real benefit for them is if you can use them to collect winter sun. If you can't do that, you're better off not having that thermal mass, because it's going to suck the warm air out of your home in winter. Not suck the warm air, it's going to absorb the heat out of the warm air. That's what it should say. So with external shading, it's really important to have it in summer, but it's equally important to be able to pull it back in winter. Adjustable, therefore, is really what you want. What I wanted to show with these pictures is that it doesn't have to be, it's sort of like with draft proofing. You may have learned this on that session you attended, that it's just, you've got to physically block the air from moving from one place to another. And just the same with external shading. It just has to physically block sun from reaching a window, and you can do it in many ways. This is probably the cheapest option, just getting a sheet and pegging it to the window. Cheap and nasty, but it will work. This one's actually also made from a sheet. This is somebody pegging up some shade cloth with some bulldog clips on the gutter. This, of course, is an awning everyone will have seen, and you can get all sorts of fancy awnings that are remote controlled and retract when the wind gets stronger and all of that sort of stuff. So you can go from super cheap and easy to whatever cost you want. It's just a matter of aesthetics, but they're all actually doing the same job. This is one of my personal favorites, is the deciduous vine, because they give you that beautiful shade in summer, but it's not just the shade, because it's a living plant and it's got all that greenery. When the wind goes through it, it actually cools it down a bit, as well as providing the shade. So I think they're brilliant. Of course, you have to sweep up all the leaves afterwards, but if you can manage that, they're a really great option. Another mention that I want to make is of Renshade foil. So this is a kind of perforated foil that you can use in summer to reflect heat away from a window. I just think so. Here's a few examples. This one is of a standard window where they've just cut it to size and stuck it on the window using Velcro dots. The same has happened here, and you can see that you can actually see through it a little bit. It doesn't completely block the view, and it may again, like the bubble wrap, it's not necessarily pretty, but if you've got a really problem room, or say someone's working at night shift in the middle of summer and their room gets really hot in the summer, this is just something to help reduce that heat. And it's also a really great option for skylights because, as I mentioned before, skylights allow a lot of heat in summer and heat out in winter. So something like that's great. And the final use of it is if you have one of those porches with a laser light deck, often in summer you can't go under them because it's like being in an oven, but you can create removable panels in the same way that you create the secondary glazing removable panels and make them to size to fit under your deck to reduce the amount of sun coming through. So it's very versatile and low cost as well. Using windows and doors for natural ventilation. Now in Melbourne, I'm in the northeast outskirts of Melbourne, and our cool breezes after a hot day are usually from the south. So I'm not sure what they're like where you are, but work out where your cooling breezes come from. And then the idea is to open a small door or window in that direction where the cool breeze is coming and a larger one opposite it. It's one of those things that's opposite what you might expect, but by opening a smaller one in the direction of the breeze, you create a suction effect that really pulls that cool air through the house. The other good use of ventilation is if you have a double-story home, stack ventilation is useful for dragging that cool air through. Often if you have a double-story home, a good place to put this, it would be like an opening skylight or something like that, and you'd put it above the stairwell, but depending on what orientation that would be, you don't really want to put a skylight here if it's west facing because you're going to get so much heat coming through. But if that's south facing, that could be an option. With windows, a lot of it is about how we actually use the things that we've set up. If we've got great window coverings inside, we need to be using them to our advantage before the problems arise. So in summer, for example, if it's going to be a really hot day, close all of the curtains and blinds before it's hot, pull down the external shading before it's hot, and then after the day, open it all up and use that ventilation to clear out the heat. In winter, even though, so you're going to bed at night, you've had a nice warm living room, even though you're going to bed and you won't notice it, it's still worth closing the curtains because that's going to help retain some of that heat inside overnight so that when you get up, it's less cold. And just a reminder to open curtains to get passive winter sunlight. Where to from here? So planning window upgrades, one thing that I think is really important with windows is that it doesn't have to be one thing for everything. I'd encourage you to think about every window as its own unique thing and also different zones of the house as their own thing. So for example, you might decide to focus your efforts on the main living space kitchen where you spend the most time and when you heat and cool the most, and make that really cozy, and then think of other parts of the house. The other thing is that different options might suit different places. Often when I'm talking to someone at an assessment, we'll talk about these things and they'll say, look, we spend most of our time in the living room, but we love looking out at the garden. There's no way we're going to close the curtain. And so in that case, there's no point putting a curtain there, because if you're not going to close it, it's not actually going to help you. In that case, maybe do some really good glazing upgrades and then use curtains for bedrooms. If you're only in there at night, then the curtain is going to be fine. Ideally, you would do both in both places, but it depends how you're going to use it and what's going to be the best effect without, going overboard on installing things. Um, the other thing is that you can try some lower cost upgrades first to see what a difference it really will make, and then go from there. So maybe some of those low cost DIY temporary things, and if it makes a massive difference, it will give you more reason to save up for some bigger picture changes. If you want more information, these three resources have fantastic information. The yourhome.gov.au manual has information on everything you can imagine, including a whole lot of windows, and you can download all sorts of PDFs from them free. Sustainability Victoria also has really good information, and Renew, that I've mentioned a couple of times, it's a not-for-profit organisation that looks at efficiency and all of these things, and they're the ones that have put out a few articles on things you can do with your windows. They'll show you comparisons between different window upgrades. That's it for me. I'm going to be sticking around for some questions, but I also wanted to mention that all of these topics and possibly more, I'm not sure if I've missed any, have all been recorded, and they're on the Greater Bendigo Climate Collaboration YouTube channel. And I also want to mention that there's a follow-up session that I'll be in Bendigo for, and it'll be a sort of a follow-up of the planning upgrade session, where you can come and just ask questions about basically anything that you've learned or that you're still wondering about. And I'll also be bringing a whole lot of examples of things. So for example, those various DIY window upgrades, I'll bring examples of all of them, so you'll be able to have a look at what they are and how they work.